was like, "What is going on?" So I look up above me, and there was a orb maybe the size of 3 buses, about 200 feet above my head, and I was in absolute shock, um, and I remember telling myself very soberly in my mind, "Don't try to interpret what this is, just observe it." So, it hovered above me for maybe 10 seconds, and I was just watching it. It was a liquid, pulsating blue liquid light, and, it was very alive and electric. It had a presence to it. Um, and after 10 seconds, it just slowly started to raise up to the cloud level, so I can only see the silhouette of it, the bright silhouette of it, and just the bottom of it. And it hovered there stationary for another 5 seconds, and then in the span of maybe a second, it shot across the sky at fantastic, impossible speeds, lit up the entire cloudscape as it was going, and just disappeared over the horizon.
All right, Jerry, welcome to Disclosure Team. First of all, how's things?
Things, if we're going by today, things are good. Thank you for asking.
Always good to hear, my friend. Well, listen, I think, we've got a lot to talk about. I really appreciate you coming on the show and kind of telling your story. And I think we're going to have a really deep, fascinating conversation. But I'd really like to set up who you are and what your background is. And, I know that you've been involved with the intelligence community and the military as well. So could you kind of give us your background when it comes to those two aspects?
Well, maybe I'll just start with what I'm doing now and work my way back. So I'm a psychotherapist who deals primarily with couples. The majority of my work is couples therapy. My background, I do have a military background. I was an intelligence specialist in the military with very brief career in the special forces community. I went in the Navy SEALs community for about 4 months before I figured out that's not what I wanted to do. But I finished out my short career in the military as an intelligence specialist. And then from then on, I went back to school in my 30s. I was working as a financial news writer to become a psychotherapist.
Amazing, amazing. And you mentioned that your short military career, but I assume it must be quite difficult to even get into those kind of positions, especially working with special forces. So, did you have to go through some training to get to that position?
Well, it's a funny thing, thinking back on what qualifies you to do those things. To be an intelligence specialist, you have to have a top secret clearance. So the majority of it is really looking at your background and whether or not you're a reliable resource that could potentially hold on to national secrets like that. And when you're only 18 years old, you don't have a whole lot of life to screw up. So I just hadn't screwed up my life to a point where it was a problem. So I qualified for those things. And the special forces was the same way. There's a high bar for sure to clear just to qualify for the Navy SEALs community. And I was lucky enough to qualify on the clearances, but also to meet the standards to be a viable candidate for the program. And yeah, I found myself in some pretty sticky predicaments early on, early on as a 19-year-old.
And just intelligence community, it's quite a broad thing. And so, what is with it? Don't go into too much detail if I don't want you to touch upon anything sensitive. But what sort of things does that role involve when you're an IC specialist?
Well, it's an IS, so it's intelligence specialist. Well, at that particular period of time, the Cold War was winding down, so the majority of it for me was briefing command personnel on cultural affairs and current events, and on classified military targets. And you get really good at interpreting data that's being collected. And a good part of my role was being part of those collection efforts and interpreting data and communicating it to the people that mattered. It was pretty stressful, to be quite honest. To be 19 years old and holding on to what qualifies national secrets, being able to communicate that in a manner that was professional and not falling apart at the seams while doing it was, yeah, no, it was a lot for me to take on when I look back on it.
I can only imagine, I put my 18, 19-year-old self in a kind of position like that, and yeah, I can't fathom the two things. It makes you grow up real quick.
Yeah, there was a lot of growing up really quick, going from high school to that kind of role in a short period of time, in a year. I was briefing command personnel on very, very sensitive subject matter. Um, you know, Part of the reason I got into that, and perhaps that'll be part of this interview, was, before I got into the military, I was thinking about what are the quickest paths to really getting some insight into what's going on with our governments. Yeah, what's going on with our government in terms of what it knows about disclosure and about UFOs. It was actually a big motivation for me when I was younger, because I had a few events early on in my life that led me to wanting to take on a role like that and potentially work my way up the food chain. So early on, it was a pretty high ambition. I was a little bit foolish thinking that I can, navigate my way through the military architecture and get to a place where I was really seeing secrets like that. But it did play into it.
Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, you mentioned that you'd had experiences prior. So let's jump right back to, I guess the first time you experienced anything anomalous, please, set the stage, set the picture, and sort of tell us how it all kind of unfolded.
I feel like there's so much to chew on here. I think the best way to set the stage for this is just the first event that I remember as a child, and the one that really triggered all my efforts to learn more about potentially what could be going on. It was around 10 years of age, and my parents were living in the suburb of Chicago. And I remember waking up at some time in the middle of the night, just awaking at my bedroom window and being confused in why I was standing in my bedroom window. But I looked out my bedroom window, and there was a classic saucer shaped craft that was hovering at maybe 100 yards outside my window. And if that wasn't confusing enough, I was pretty dumbfounded by that. There was a bean standing in the middle of the craft. So the bottom portion was spinning, and the top portion was standing still. And there was a row of windows around it, which is unique because you don't really hear that often when people talk about seeing craft. But there was windows, and there was a bean, like a classic tall gray, that was just locked in eye contact with me. And as the memory goes, I just was transfixed and maintained eye contact for a couple minutes, and then just turned and walked back to my bed and went to sleep. So after that, uh, a number of things started to happen. One was I was getting regular visits in my home by a blue orb. Um, I would awake in the middle of the night, and I
What
would
sort of
see this.
size would that orb have been?
It was a beach ball sized blue orb, so it was pretty big. Um, this is what I recall from my memory, waking up in the middle of the night, roughly around the same time in the middle of the night, probably around 2 o'clock, around there. And I would see this orb appear in the hallway that was outside of my bedroom, and it would come through the wall, and it would slowly um, travel down the hallway to my bedroom, where it would. I was in a bunk bed. My brother was in the bottom bunk, and it would raise up to eye level, and it would just sit there with me. And I remember as a child just sitting there with this blue orb, transfixed in eye contact with it, and nothing was really transpiring as far as I could tell. It was just, why is it here kind of thing, and being amazed by it and just sitting with it. And then at some point it would just leave the same way that it came in, and I would watch it disappear down the hallway. There was one thing that was pretty phenomenal about it that made me think that maybe this was a psychological phenomena later on when I was an adult, when I looked back on it. Whenever it would leave, it would disappear through the wall in the hallway, but it would make an extraordinarily loud explosion noise, almost like a stick of dynamite or like an M4 or something going off. And, every time that would happen, I would think everybody in the house would be woken up by it, but I would be amazed that nobody would be awake. So I would I'd wake everybody up in the house afterwards to find out, like, why didn't they hear this thing? So my mother still has recollection of me doing that. So, um, but that was the main things that happened in my childhood. I had perhaps the strangest of all strange things happened with a high strangeness event, that came when I was about 11 or 12 years old. Um, it's so strange. I'm reluctant to tell it. And I cannot not tell it because, having had those things happen to me as a child makes me think there's some relationship between high strangeness and having visitation encounters. So perhaps the strangest thing happened to me around 11 years old, and this was a high strangeness event. And it's hard for me not to talk about this event, even though it's very different from my visitation events. It's hard for me not to talk about it because it's hard for me not to think that there's some relationship between those past events and what happened as a high strangeness event later on when I was a little bit further down the road. So after the Blue Orb event, I was in Colorado visiting my father, and I was outside with my brother, and we uh, we were playing in the mountains, which we like to do. My father's home was nestled in a mountain range, and it's a very beautiful part of Colorado. So we would get a little wild, and we'd go outside and play. And so we found a meadow that we were playing in, and we were just throwing stones. Well, I picked up a stone to throw it, and a stone came back and hit my brother. And my brother looked at me and thought that I was playing some sort of trick on him, and I wasn't. So we went to test this phenomenon because I was like, I definitely didn't do that to you. I don't know how that happened." So I picked up another stone, and 2 stones came back this time. So we were pretty freaked out, and we decided to test it a little bit further, because we weren't sure what was going on. So we decided to really pay attention to the trajectory of this stone when we threw it so we could figure out what was going on. And I picked up a stone and I hurled it, and I could see in midair it was when it was on a trajectory to go into the distance that it turned around in mid-flight and came back at me. At this point, we got really freaked out. My brother was only about 9 at the time, so he was pretty frightened by that, and we ended up running back towards my father's house, and we went to a neighbor's house where a friend was at. We knocked on the door, and this neighbor friend came out, and we told him about what was going on, and of course, he didn't believe it, right? We were just little kids, and he thought we were playing a joke on him. So my brother said, "Okay, well, we'll prove it." So he looked at me like I was gonna take responsibility for proving this phenomena was real. So we went into the yard, and we all had our backs to he had a trailer, and we all had our backs to the home because we were afraid, and I kinda, like, crept out from underneath the overhang of this trailer, and I picked up a rock and I threw it, and nothing happened for maybe 5 seconds. So he looked at me like we're all crazy, and I crept back out to look up at the sky to see if anything was coming, and I kid you not, a railroad stake fell out of the sky and hit me on the head. Um, uh, to say that we were shocked would be a mass understatement. It hit me on the head, and there was a little trickle of blood that came down, and we picked up the object, and we looked at it, and the kid was so distraught, he ran back into his house, and we ran back to my father's house, and, we had no explanation for that event. Um, we told my father about it, but he thought that that was just craziness, and it was just something that I filed in my childhood that could never be explained. But definitely, um, high strangeness at its finest, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both of those childhood events must have been, it must have had such an impact on you at such a young age as well. You know, you mentioned, let's just go back to the blue orbs in the bedroom, because you said you were on a bunk beds. And was there ever any occasion where your brother witnessed or woke up around the time when this was actually happening?
No, I do remember as a child being stuck with this quandary of, like, this appears to be happening to me, but nobody else, so I wanted to get everybody else involved. I was feeling alone and isolated in those events and, confused by them. So I would try to wake my brother up, on occasion when it was happening and he wouldn't wake up. So I was actually aware enough and cognizant as a child that I was experimenting with it. Like, I was trying um, to validate that it was happening not just only to me, but the phenomena wasn't playing along. And all the way up to an adult, I wasn't convinced that that was a real phenomena. Wasn't sure whether or not it was a psychological phenomena or a symptom of some other pathology. I wasn't sure what it was. And given that high strangeness event, I thought, what was this? Some sort of episode, maybe some sort of early schizophrenic episode. I had no explanation for it, except there was another witness there that saw it. And with the orb experiences, that was a phenomena that I experienced entirely on my own and had no explanation for. It left me with a lot of questions, but I think more as a child, it left me feeling other. I had experiences that I couldn't really talk about. I was trying to talk about them with my family, and they didn't really have the bandwidth to entertain it, to entertain too much conversation around it, except everything's gonna be okay, and, this is likely just a dream. Um, so I think it was the beginning of a complex as a child, which resulted in emotional isolation and, and a deep feeling of otherness, like, "Why is this happening to me? Nobody has an explanation, nor do I have anybody to talk to it about with."
Yeah, that's so bizarre. I mean, you'd think, if it was a one-off occurrence, then the question of it being potentially a dream would be, a reasonable explanation. But to have things happen on multiple occasions, things are so different, from the blue orbs to seeing a disc to then the high strangeness at your father's house. There's too many things there to really just simply brush it aside as a dream state every single time.
Things were adding up at that point in my childhood that there could be something, bigger going on, but, I really didn't have a conduit to talk talk about it with to anybody. So I think this is I'm a producer of, documentary podcasts, and a lot of the podcasts that I've produced have been around contact stories. Um, that is a classic motif that you hear is that sense of isolation that happens in childhood that can lead to a deep sense of otherness and it can lead to things like depression, early on. There's no explanations for these things, and society doesn't hold an explanation either, so there's really no safe place to go with them. It just creates a complicated psychological territory to grow up around, right?
These things were happening around that young age, and that did it kind of compel you to actually do any research or look at anything with relations to high strangeness, UFO subject? Did it push you to actually go and watch things and try and search for answers?
Yeah, another classic, response to that level of confusion that I was having was I dug into everything that I could find that could possibly give me an explanation. From religious texts as a kid to, going to the school library and, taking up books on the paranormal and UFOs and, getting strange looks from the librarian and, um, any show that had some sort of theme that dealt with, the supernatural or the paranormal or dealt with UFOs, sci-fi, Star Trek was a big one. Yeah, I really got into all of those things because it was the only place where I felt like I could breathe around it. It gave me a sense of a place, a safe space, to just play with the ideas of what it could be. Nobody nobody that I talked to wanted to play around with what it could be, and, I became very sensitive to that as a child, really feeling out people's aversion to the topic. I didn't want to create discomfort in people, and I noticed early on, even with my family, discussing it created discomfort, and that was the last thing that I wanted to create. So, yeah, I went deep into research, and it later on in life, I followed that whole trend, um, and ended up becoming a researcher of the phenomena as a graduate faculty member. I was doing research with MUFON, where I was working as a psychotherapist with contactees to get close to the phenomena to try to figure out, how much of this is really psychologically related versus something that's happening in real time that's related to a real palpable phenomena. Um, yeah, so I started, when I got old enough, I wanted to go deeper and take a look at it and have a direct conversation with people that were experiencing the phenomena. And I don't know if that actually, um, clarified much for me. It actually, added to the complexity of how, how confusing the topic really can be, especially when you bring in things like mental health into the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the more you look into this subject, more questions arise, and it certainly becomes more complicated. But so you've had your childhood experiences, you've gone through into your teenage years, joined the military. Was there any occasion while you were in your short military career where you brought the subject up loosely with anyone to try and sort of get any kind of information?
My military experience was so intense and so fast, that I didn't, do what I had set out to do when I joined the military to learn more about the phenomena. It was, it demanded so much of my attention and my energy that, I really didn't pull the thread very much. There was still curiosity, and the curiosity was more related to if I stick with the military, will this ultimately play out where I can have access to those sort of things? Um, but the demands of my job and the demands on me, and my mental energy and my physical energy was just too much for me to really do much with it, to be quite honest. And nothing, I was talking to some service members about it. I remember that, a few that I felt that it was safe to do that with, to find out if anybody else had had similar experiences. Kind of doing my own survey, but I was not pulling files to and searching in places that I shouldn't be searching. I wasn't doing anything like that.
Could you have if you wanted to? Did having a top secret clearance?
Well, that's a good question. I was connected to a squadron. I was connected to a squadron that hunted submarines, Russian submarines. So a lot of those planes were in the air for a lot of periods of time, and I'm sure that I could have done some digging to find out what percentage of those had run into UAP or what were really considered UFOs at the time. I probably could have, got information around that, and probably could have done my own surveys with the pilots that I was working with and things like that. But I didn't. I didn't do it.
I mean, that's understandable. It's easy looking.
I know that's not great for the story.
No, no, no. But the thing is, you put yourself in that position at that time, and it's easy now to look back and think, I could have, I should have, and all that kind of thing. But you're young, you've got this career which sounds intense at the time, and I kind of understand that. But let's move on from the military career. You obviously realized, like you said earlier, that it wasn't for you and you wanted to change direction. So you went to school again and that. So bring us out into, post military, into this new direction, and how your mind was then feeling about the everything that had happened to you. Because, it sounds like it was always there in your mind.
Yeah, post-military was really about educating myself, so it was about, getting my bachelor's degree and then eventually my master's degree. Once I started getting back into school, I started allowing myself to think about these things again, My first degree was in philosophy, and my second was in psychology, so I could become a psychotherapist. When I was in graduate school, this is when I really started to allow myself to follow my original instincts, which started to show up as a kid, and to research the matter a little bit more. It gave me the legitimacy to reach out to some of the top researchers in ufology at the time. I was in correspondence with Leslie Kean, and she was putting me in touch with Bud Hopkins archives, and I was speaking with David Jacobs, and a number of different people that were in the psychology community, that were transpersonal therapists, that were looking at the topic. And I started to reach out to people like Kathy Martin and Mary Rodwell, and I was put into contact with contactees. So I was pretty ambitious in graduate school, where I started these research projects to look at contactee phenomena. And I was lucky enough to have good support staff in school that encouraged that sort of thing, good advisors that were okay with it. And I started doing some therapy with, and MUFON was funneling me contactees. And I really wanted to look at what percentage of these people that were having contact experiences were having parallel challenges with mental health issues, right? And what percentage of people that were struggling with mental health issues were they before the events or after the events, or they because of the events, or so I was looking at that complexity of, what percentage of people that have contact experience have conditions before the events unfold, and it was all based upon my confusion with that whole issue. Like, how much of what I was experiencing when I was a child could have been related to something, the pathology of something unfolding in terms of a mental health condition. I didn't know, so I wanted to look, and I did a lot of research on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really interesting. So, what did the data show initially? And you'd spoken to a few people, some experiences. What was the kind of percentages looking like when it came to predisposed mental health issues, and, well, I guess ones that didn't show anything like that? What was the kind of breakdown looking like?
Yeah, well, I was looking at, things like family dysfunction, like how many of these people that have later contactee experiences experienced a lot of family dysfunction. And I would say a good percentage of people, I was finding correlations between family dysfunction and contact experiences later on. The majority of people that were experiencing mental health issues, things like depression, psychoses, things that could really, really unfold and go in a pretty negative direction, seem to be happening after, like, contact events. However, um, a few people, there was correlations between people that had things like lifelong depression and contact experiences, but the majority of them seem to be unfolding from the contact events themselves. From there, it got really muddy. What are the effects of a contact experience? How much of this is organic, um, and a result of that contact experience, and how much of this is triggering deeper psychological issues, psychological processes that could be potentially pathological? It got really muddy once contact happened. It's really difficult to see what is going on there, whether or not it's an effect of the encounter, or whether or not this is a result of things like the anxiety and the stress that comes as a result of the encounter. It's really hard to tell, but there was a high correspondence between contact and mental health issues for sure. Um, and the variety of contact experiences, you often I saw a lot of complexity in original contact events, and then deepening contact events after the original event. So a person might have a sighting, for instance, let's say, and then weeks and months down the road, they're having additional encounters that are dreamlike, and that lead to things like deep psychological stress and neuroses, and even psychoses in some case.
Yeah, that must be really difficult as well for someone like yourself. Well, for anybody looking in from that side of things, how do you differentiate between what could potentially be in the mind to actually being something in reality? How did you kind of figure that out with these different people? Because I assume they're all different ages and backgrounds.
I didn't figure it out. It was more like treating the symptoms. You just do your best to treat the symptoms, and I think at a certain point, I was seeing the dilemma that you know, um, that the mental health community has in treating people that have contact events, that a lot of what they're being presented with, mental health practitioners are being presented with, are serious symptoms that have to be treated. And there's really not room in the literature for understanding of the reality of a contact event. So a lot of people just get pushed into boxes that, oh, this looks like depression, or this looks like, BPD, bipolar disorder. This looks like extreme anxiety, or uh, brief psychotic disorders. They get pushed into these boxes because they need to be treated. And that's in terms of how I was dealing with it when I was working as a psychotherapist with contactees, was doing my best to educate the people that I was working with on mental health issues, period, just while giving them weight for their experience to be real and true, being supported around the reality of their experiences while treating mental health. Mental health is a real um, it's a real effect of contact that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. Um, and many contactees in the community just avoid the mental health community for that very reason, because they end up getting labeled and diagnosed. That's a problem, but it's even a bigger problem not to be treated, because these encounters are leading to having real impact on a person's psychological well-being. I know, because it happened to me later on in life. So I went off and I went to studying this stuff, and then later on in my life, I had another series of events that happened, that helped me look at all of my events. It put them into perspective altogether.
So let's just stick before we move on to the other events that occurred. Where when you were dealing with these experiences and helping them out, were you telling them that you were also an experiencer, or did you kind of hold that back as to not, you know?
No, I did. I really wanted to keep the research clean, and I didn't really wanna create any kind of cognitive biases. I really wanted to see, the phenomena and its impact as cleanly as I could, without, potentially, influencing the direction of somebody's narrative. I really didn't wanna do that. So I wouldn't, but they knew that they had a safe therapist. They had a person that was associated with MUFON and that was, doing research, so they had that level of safety and security, I think.
And were you reporting back to MUFON on each individual case you were dealing with? Were you writing reports for them or anything like that to kind of gather data?
No, I would pretty much, I didn't I was kind of a lone wolf. I was running my own research projects, and they were mostly academic. They liked what I was doing, and so that's why they agreed to work with me. Occasionally, I would connect with Kathy Martin, and we would talk about what I was finding and what I was seeing, and she would corroborate a lot of it. It was a lot of things that she already knew herself. Um, but I was doing some, I was keeping writing, white papers on it and academic, qualitative research on it. So, that she was getting something of use from it as well. Kathy Martin at that time was responsible for pretty much looking at abductee phenomena at MUFON. She was the person.
So you mentioned that you're writing white papers. Were they going out into the academic community?
They were just going to the, um, people at my schools, and, I did have one, survey that I had created that got published with Free. I don't know if you remember that organization with Ray Hernandez.
Maybe.
he had created a research organization with Edgar Mitchell,
Yes.
the former astronaut. So they had published some of the surveys that I'd done, and so, some of the stuff was going somewhere.
That's always good to hear. Sure, no, understandable, especially at that time, the certainly the UFO subject was still full of stigma and ridicule, and a lot more than it is today. So that must have been a real challenge in itself at that time.
Yeah, it was there was enough people with their fingers in academia that it wasn't too hard, to get some movement, but there was still kind of the aversion to the topic within mainstream academia. Like there are a few places that you could go with it. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, no, of course. So during this time, you're working with MUFON, speaking to experiences. At this point in your life, with your own personal experiences, nothing was happening at that stage. Am I right?
Zero was going on with me. It wasn't until just a couple years ago that phenomena started to happen again. It was well, actually, I had one experience in 2009 that I was pretty convinced that I was going crazy. Let's just put it that way. That's the quick road to, explaining 2009 when my first event happened. It was an experience that, I would call a transformational crisis. So, in psychological literature, we don't have a whole lot of room for experiences that, um, uh, involve altered states of consciousness. So altered states of consciousness might involve things like seeing things, so, visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, and I had an event. It was a pretty big event in my life where that happened, which involved heavy ET themes. So it involved, this is an experience which, psychologists like Dr. Stan Groff would call a transformational or a spiritual emergency. It had it was a very intense psychological experience of experiencing universal grace. It was like an experience with a higher intelligence, and it was a deep conversation which, was happening all on the inside, but it was triggered by an event in my home. So I had walked in my home and I noticed that the clocks in the kitchen had stopped, and I was a little curious about that. So I went in the living room and the clocks in the living room had stopped, and I saw another clock that had stopped too. And I wasn't sure what was happening. And I look outside my window and it looked like Armageddon, was about to unfold. The cloudscapes were like they were on a time lapse. They were going very quickly, and they were turning colors. And I got in touch with some sort of higher intelligence that took me through a conversation about universal grace, which to me, I was perfectly conscious and perfectly aware and centered during the entire thing. Um, was pretty confused about. I was in graduate school to be a psychotherapist, and I'm living with my partner and fiance at the time was a clinical psychologist at Yale and finishing up her postdoc. So I'm very aware of the territory I was in when I was in it. I was like, okay, um, this is potentially something like psychoses, and or one of these transformational experiences that I've been reading about that like Dr. Stan Groff talks about, like a spiritual emergency. That event unfolded on the other side of that conversation about universal grace, with an encounter with three beings that claim to be extraterrestrials. And they said pretty point blank in this altered states of consciousness that I was in that we are what many people on the earth would consider extraterrestrials, but we've been here all along since the beginning of time. And I was pretty blown away. And after that event, it got even weirder. So I get introduced to these 3 beings, and this is all auditory. Like, I don't see them. They're not physical. So I go upstairs to my bedroom, and I'm hearing these voices of these 3 3 quote unquote extraterrestrials, which at the point that I'm hearing this, I'm thinking to myself, I'm losing it. I go into my bedroom and the phone rings, and it's my cell phone. So I pick up the cell phone, and it was one of the cell phones in 2007 that you have the numbers on the backside. So I look at the number and it says 0000000. And I'm like, okay, what is this? And I pick it up, and I hear what sounds like a dialect between a dolphin and crickets. And it was this alien dialect that just went on for maybe a minute straight and then just hung up. And yeah, and the there was no record of it in my phone afterwards. It was just completely gone. Like when you get the numbers that had called list, it wasn't in the numbers that had called list or anything. So, um, that experience on the other side of it, there was a number of other things that happened, but those were the big memorable, um, take homes from that. Was a direct conversation with my partner at the time, who was a clinical psychologist at Yale, and I was in graduate school to be a psychotherapist, that I was pretty sure that I didn't have an explanation for what had happened to me, that it could be psychosis. So I started a conversation with the mental health community at that particular point in time, trying to put together exactly what happened to me. And a lot of that conversation that I had around my own mental health was about what is the relationship between what had happened to me in the past, in my childhood, between what has happened to me now. There appeared to be a thread that was consistent in both past experiences and that present experience. So after that experience, I basically agreed to file it as a psychological phenomenon. I thought that my exposure to the theme as a child had made a great impact on me, and that later on, due to trauma in my own life, it was later triggered at a time, particularly troublesome time in my relationship with my partner at the time, that led to this kind of crisis moment with these themes. Now, it had these very transformational and beneficent themes attached to it, universal grace, and these figures that came forward and everything were friendly and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't malevolent. But to me, it seemed too coincidental. So I just agreed to let it go. And so 2 years ago, um, I have this um, ritual that I like to do. I'm a couples therapist, and I work with couples that are in various states of chaos and duress, and dealing with that all day long can be very stressful. So I've created a ritual where after a long day of work, I go to Whole Foods and I grab some dinner, and I go up to an overlook and I just stargaze. It helps me unwind. It's just a nice way to let a hard day go.
Sure.
About 2 years ago, this is in the summer of 2022, I started seeing things in the sky. Um, it started with what looked like maybe stars the size of, like, what you would see with, like, Jupiter, that would suddenly appear in the sky, and they would flash very brightly like a strobe and then just disappear. And I was like, I didn't know what it was, but I was definitely curious about it. I thought, maybe I'm just not aware of, what the technology is that we have in terms of illuminating space junk in the sky, and could be those things. But it started with just the flash. But I would come up to that same spot, and maybe once out of every 5 days, I would see the same thing again, to the point where I was showing up. It started to happen like once every 3 days. And now I was seeing new behaviors. So I would see these stars that would show like the size of Jupiter, that would slowly appear in the sky. And then they would start to strobe about 2 to 5 times their brightness, get very, very, very bright, track for maybe another 30 seconds in the sky and disappear. So I'm like, okay. So the year's going on and these things are happening with more and more regularity where I'm seeing more behaviors. And it got to the point where this is around fall of 2022, I started to see spectacular things in the sky, not just things that I was curious about that could potentially be other technology that I was still telling myself that it's perhaps that. I was seeing things that I could no longer say that this is definitely that. So these lights were now dropping to like maybe 500 feet elevation, and they would hover and be stationary for maybe 15 seconds, and then they would shoot into the sky and disappear at impossible speeds in a matter of nanoseconds. So I was like, okay, now something's definitely going on. Up until that point, I didn't. There was a part of me that was really resistant to validating the phenomena as something that could be anomalous. Because of my past experiences, I was really averse to doing it. So I was demanding a pretty, um, my standard that I had set for it to be real was really high. And, so when they started to drop down to 500 feet and then take off at impossible speeds, I started to go, okay, now something's going on. So in the fall of October 2022 is when the cap got blown off. I'd finished up a hard day of couples therapy, grabbed a burrito at Whole Foods, went up to the same spot I always go up to. Um, and I was wondering if I was going to see something again. And it happened to be a fairly overcast day. It was like a fog and a cloud cover, but it was thin enough that you could still see the stars that bleeding through the clouds. And at one point, I got out of my car and I noticed that my body was casting a shadow. I was like, "What is going on?" So I look up above me, and there was a orb, maybe the size of 3 buses, about 200 feet above my head, and I was in absolute shock. Um, and I remember telling myself very soberly in my mind, "Don't try to interpret what this is, just observe it." So it hovered above me for maybe 10 seconds, and I was just watching it. It was a liquid, pulsating blue liquid light, and it was very alive and electric. It had a presence to it. Um, and after 10 seconds, it just slowly started to raise up to the cloud level. So I can only see the silhouette of it, the bright silhouette of it, and just the bottom of it. And it hovered there stationary for another 5 seconds. And then in the span of maybe a second, it shot across the sky at fantastic, impossible speeds, lit up the entire cloudscape as it was going, and just disappeared over the horizon. So I was completely blown away, and this is the point in time where I started to, add some things up. I was doing my own calculus, and my calculus was there was a lot of things in my past that I really didn't wanna give weight to actual credence. Gr um, I wanted to categorize it as a psychological phenomena just because of my own discomfort, but I was starting to see that perhaps, what I was really involved with were real events, real waking events, and this is how it all added up over time. Why there was this expanse of time between those experiences, why it took so long, I have no idea. But, I can't be here now and think that there isn't a relationship. So the reason I'm here talking to you today is because I can step outside my home every night and I can see phenomena in the sky every single night. Um, and I'm it's um it's mind-bogglingly confusing to me how this could be happening to me and how I got to this point that it's happening this regularly to me. I'm lucky enough to have correspondence with people like Chris Mellon and Chris Bledsoe, and so now I'm being encouraged and coached to, have other people look at the actual phenomena. I really think science holds the answers for what is potentially going on. And one step to take to really get clear on what is going on is to look at the actual phenomena that's happening in waking real life. And there's lights in the sky that I see, like Chris Bledsoe, pretty much the same kind of stuff. We talk. I think he has more close encounters than I have. I see a lot of phenomena in the sky, um, but it's very similar. And I don't, the only answer I can give is there must be some sort of correlation between what has happened to me, which I would call transformational events, psychic events, and also, real childhood events.
Yeah. So since that the big blue orb, did it go back to kind of the more of the sort of lights in the sky doing maneuvers, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
And
it's really yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, following leading on the end of that question is a secondary question of, I guess anybody watching this is naturally going to ask, well, if you're seeing them so regularly, surely you must have pulled out your cell phone and taken footage of these things at all. What's is that something that you've managed to capture?
Been a clumsy learning curve on, like, capturing this stuff. You know, I'm a documentary producer of these kind of stories, and these are kind of the questions, of course, that I ask to people. I will say this, that there is definitely a learning curve to capturing objects in the night sky. The standard of equipment that you have to get, quality captures of that sort of things is you're starting at, like, $5,000 for video equipment to actually get good captures. You can try to get it on your phone, and it's pretty inconsistent. I've done it. I've captured it on, night vision equipment, but it's not super expensive equipment, and it doesn't looks that phenomenal. It looks like little specks of white light in a black expanse of sky, but you can see the behaviors, and I could show you the videos that I've captured, but I need people with, more legitimate equipment to really capture how spectacular it really is. It doesn't really come off, as spectacular on the stuff that I've caught it on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because all the time people on social media in particular just screaming out saying, we've all got a cell phone in our pocket with a high definition camera. Surely we'd be able to capture this thing. And it really isn't the case at all. I'd say to anybody, try capturing a great image of, an aeroplane moving in the sky and that. It's so difficult.
Well, when you have an object that's the size of maybe the star of Jupiter, when you look at that in the night sky and you're standing on the ground and looking at a clear night sky, it looks really spectacular. Try to capture that on your phone. So now imagine, something the size of the planet Jupiter doing fantastic things in the sky and trying to capture that on your phone. It's not easy to do. And that's okay. I'm open to that sort of criticism because it would be the same criticism that I have. Um, to me, the conversation has got to be about handing off the baton to people that do have the skill set and also the equipment and the scientific equipment to accurately capture the phenomena, to take this conversation one step further. Because I don't know, my experiences don't add up to one bit of knowing, what these objects are in the sky. I just know that I have had these experiences in the past. How much of that correlates to what I'm seeing? I don't know. I think there's some sort of correlation, but it doesn't help me explain what I'm seeing. I don't have a clue as to what the intelligence is that's operating these things. And my experience is as fantastic as they have been in my life, don't clarify that question of intelligence, what intelligence, the what. I don't have any more insight into that as anybody else. I just know that I've had experiences that have opened me up to addressing this question from multiple levels, that there's a relationship not just in real time that's happening in real waking life, but there's also likely a relationship between altered states of consciousness in these kind of experiences, that they impact us not just at the mental level, but at a level that which people might call a spiritual level or a psycho-spiritual level. And I'm not a huge fan of the term spiritual at all. I think it's the best language that we can use for things like that are like noetic experiences, transformational experiences, that have big themes attached to them, like things like universal grace, for instance. Those are the best words that we have. But there is some sort of correlation. That's what my life shows, and, it seems to show. I will put seems to show on it. I think way a lot more research needs to be done on what are the actual impacts of getting close to the phenomena? How does that impact us, our brain states and our neurobiology? We don't know.
I think that's the major thing. It's okay to say, I don't know. I don't know what these things are. And I think the way that you look at it is very grounded, and it's a very healthy way of looking at it, and by not pretending to know what it is or trying to interpret it to fit in a certain on a certain shelf to make it feel more comfortable. You know, you're looking at it from a very, subjective and grounded way. And I think that's really, I think that's I think that would help anybody else who's dealing with this to see that somebody such as yourself, with your background, with your profession, with your experiences, you know, not just claiming to have answers, almost claiming the opposite to sort of,
I'm really doing my best to make sure that I'm emphasizing that I don't have answers. There's a lot of people, I do a lot of documentary work, and I think there's a lot of people that have these experiences that find themselves moving into the role of spokesperson and mouthpiece, um, for these experiences and start to put certain narratives to them. It's either this or that, and start speaking in languages of the either ors. And, um, and I know people, in the contactee community that do things like claim like there's a relationship between what I'm thinking and the phenomena, and there's no way in hell that I'm saying something like that. I walk out at nighttime and I see it. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not praying to it. I'm not doing any of that stuff. What is the relationship between me being there and the phenomena? That's the mystery. I don't know. And it's really hard for me to look at my life and think that my past experiences don't have something to do with it, because I also have to look at the truth. It's not happening to everybody. So if it's not happening to everybody, there must be some sort of relationship between past experiences and present phenomena. Um, but I'm not claiming that I have any special talent or skills, or, it's how I'm thinking or how I'm praying or anything like that. I don't, I think that's sticky territory to get into that could potentially complicate and confuse the topic.
absolutely. I completely agree 100%. And I guess with that, what does the future look like then? How are you going to tackle this? How do you think that you're going to continue to search for those answers?
I've only recently, you're the first show that I've agreed to, like, come out and talk about my own experiences. I've been very comfortable behind the camera and behind the microphone producing stories, partly because of my job as a psychotherapist. I've been very reluctant and averse to putting my story out there, potentially complicating my career and my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I've agreed to do it with some encouragement from some people in the disclosure community. You know, I'm very lucky to have a correspondence with Chris Mellon, and he's encouraged me to reach out to the Tedesco brothers. So we'll see. I definitely think the answer for me is, I don't think my story is that important. I think what's important is I'm actually seeing things in the sky, and that's something that's potentially important for humanity in getting more research and professionals that have the skill sets to analyze what that is the most important aspect of it, not anything that I talked to you about today. I think, that's my personal story, but what's potentially helpful for humanity is let's put some boots on the ground and let's take a look at what's happening on, that I'm seeing so we can potentially move the whole conversation about disclosure forward. I would feel silly. That's the only reason I've agreed to come out. I feel like I could potentially be doing a disservice if this is real and is happening to me, that if I don't start to reach out to the larger community that everybody could benefit from, that I'd be missing the boat, not just for me, but for many people, and I don't think that's fair. So it took a lot for me to come out and talk about it, but it's really that. It's really about moving the science forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I personally really do appreciate you trusting me to kind of be the first show that you talk to about your personal experiences. But then I think that the comments you just made there are a real testament to your character, that as much as what you've experienced and how you probably would like answers to all of that, but you're looking at the bigger picture as it pertains to humanity, as you say. And I think that's really, honorable. And so I really appreciate both sides to this story, the big picture and what you're doing and trying to progress with, to then, having your own personal experiences as well. So the whole thing, just, I think it's really valid and really important, and I think it really will help in the grand scheme of things. So, thank you, really, at the end of the day, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I think the truth is I'm just as eager and giddy as anybody else to understand what's going on. How much of the psychology of my experiences, how that relates to the reality of the phenomena, I want to know. I wanna know, and, I don't have answers. So I need to start connecting with people that potentially could start moving us to answers. It's an exciting thing and also it's been a perplexing thing to live with, to create room that an impossible thing could really be happening. Takes some unique steps internally, to create room for. Um, I've had to do some maneuvering and moving the furniture around on the interior to make room for the reality of something seemingly impossible to be happening, and it appears to be happening. And I'm also open to somebody coming out and being like, "Okay, we figured out this is something else." That's completely fine with me. Just getting clear on what it is what's important to me.
Yeah, that's what I always say to people. Whatever this turns out to be, we all have a part to play, and we can all do our bit. And I think coming together like this is only going to be a positive move in the long run. And I think, there has been a lot of focus in the past few years looking at the very militarized government aspect of disclosure, but it's time for experiences to come forward, because they're the ones that have seen this firsthand and have experienced and gone through these things, and have kind of been pushed into the background in a lot of cases. And so I think now is the time for everybody to come together and really try and figure this out as best we can collectively. So again, this is the kind of thing with you stepping forward where I see other people may see that and go, now it's my time to come forward. And it just has this knock on effect. And I think it's just, again, a big positive.
Yeah, I think we need to get more people sharing their stories. I think now is the time for experiencers to share. I'm with you on that. Because we have to add it up. Like how much of what we're hearing in experiencers' stories adds up to the actual phenomena, and what will it reveal about the phenomena? I think there's a lot to be learned here, if we open up and share more about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, listen, Jerry, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking with you. And to anybody out there who is watching this, who has, gone through something and wants to come forward, my DMs are open. You can find all my social medias in the description below. I'm always open to listening, no judgment. But yeah, I hope you guys have taken something away from this conversation. And to everyone watching, as always, I really appreciate all the support. And I thank you as always. And we'll see you again soon. For now, take care and goodbye.